Skepticism, and the underdetermination principle. In contemporary epistemology, the underdetermination principle plays a crucial role in arguments for radical skepticism. This principle challenges our everyday assumptions about knowledge by suggesting that our beliefs about the world may be no more justified than alternative, incompatible hypotheses. The underdetermination principle essentially posits that if a person, S, has a belief, P, but lacks a rational basis to prefer P over an incompatible alternative hypothesis, Q, then S does not genuinely know P. In other words, if the evidence available to a person does not decisively support one scenario over another, that person cannot claim to have knowledge of the scenario they believe to be true. This principle is especially relevant in discussions of perceptual knowledge, where our sensory experiences could potentially support multiple, conflicting interpretations of reality. Before we move on to the skeptical use of the underdetermination principle, we must make an important distinction. There is a common misconception that for evidence to favor one hypothesis, H, over another competing hypothesis, H, the evidence must entail the truth of H. This strict interpretation might be seen as echoing Descartes' approach in his first meditation, where he questions whether our evidence can ever provide absolute certainty about the world. However, this interpretation is overly demanding and misrepresents the broader applicability of the principle. The underdetermination principle can be understood as requiring only that one's evidence probabilistically supports H over H, without necessitating that the evidence entails the truth of H. Let's explore this distinction with some examples. To begin, consider an example where evidence does indeed entail the truth of a hypothesis. Suppose you have a mathematical proof that demonstrates that a triangle's interior angles always sum to 180 degrees in Euclidean geometry. In this case, the proof serves as evidence that entails the truth of the proposition H. The interior angles of any triangle sum to 180 degrees. The evidence, the proof, guarantees that H is true in any scenario where the principles of Euclidean geometry apply. Here, the evidence leaves no room for doubt or alternative hypotheses, as it logically entails the truth of H. However, this kind of entailment is rare outside of formal disciplines like mathematics or logic. In everyday life and empirical sciences, our evidence typically does not entail the truth of our beliefs with such certainty. Instead, evidence often supports a hypothesis in a probabilistic manner, where it increases the likelihood of H being true without guaranteeing it. Now, let's consider an example where evidence only probabilistically supports a hypothesis. Imagine you are in a courtroom, and the prosecution presents a fingerprint found at the scene of a crime. The fingerprint matches that of the defendant. The hypothesis H is the defendant was at the crime scene, while the competing hypothesis H might be the defendant was not at the crime scene. The fingerprint evidence does not entail that the defendant was at the crime scene. It is possible that the fingerprint was left at another time, or that it was planted. However, the fingerprint does probabilistically support the hypothesis that the defendant was present at the scene, making H more likely than H. The evidence increases the probability that H is true, but does not conclusively prove it. This is typical of how evidence works in many real-world scenarios. It makes a particular hypothesis more plausible without guaranteeing its truth. Understanding the underdetermination principle as requiring only probabilistic support rather than entailment allows us to appreciate its relevance in a wide range of contexts. For example, when scientists gather evidence to support a theory, they rarely, if ever, obtain evidence that entails the theory's truth. Instead, they accumulate evidence that makes the theory more probable than competing theories. A biologist might observe a correlation between a certain genetic mutation and a disease, supporting the hypothesis that the mutation causes the disease. This evidence does not entail the truth of the hypothesis, as other factors could be at play, but it does make the hypothesis more probable. Next, consider a simple example to illustrate how the underdetermination principle might lead to skepticism. Imagine a student who believes they are seated at their desk, proposition E. However, they also recognize that it is possible, though highly unlikely, that they are instead standing by a window, proposition F. The student's evidence, which is their current sensory experience, could theoretically support either scenario. If the student has no stronger reason to believe they are seated at the desk rather than standing by the window, their belief in being seated does not amount to knowledge. This example demonstrates how underdetermination can lead to skepticism. If our evidence for believing that we are seated at a desk is no more compelling than the evidence for an alternative scenario, then we cannot confidently claim to know which scenario is true. This skepticism challenges our everyday beliefs, suggesting that they might be more fragile and uncertain than we typically assume. The underdetermination principle plays a central role in radical skepticism by highlighting the potential for equally plausible yet incompatible explanations for our experiences. This principle is often invoked in thought experiments like the brain in a vat (BIV) hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, a person might believe they are living an ordinary life, but in reality, they could be a disembodied brain receiving artificial sensory inputs. The BIV scenario and the ordinary scenario are indistinguishable from the person's perspective because both provide identical sensory experiences. The underdetermination principle suggests that because the person has no rational basis to prefer the ordinary scenario over the BIV scenario, they cannot claim to know the truth about their situation. This leads to a powerful form of skepticism. If we cannot rule out these radical hypotheses, then our claims to knowledge about the external world are undermined. The implications of the underdetermination principle lead to what is known as the inconsistent triad, which consists of three seemingly plausible yet incompatible claims. 1. One cannot have rational support that favors their belief in an everyday proposition, e.g., I am seated at a desk, over an incompatible radical skeptical hypothesis, e.g., I am a brain in a vat. 2. The underdetermination principle, which holds that without rational support favoring one belief over another, one does not have knowledge. 3. One has widespread, everyday knowledge. These three claims cannot all be true simultaneously. If we accept the first two claims, we must reject the third, leading to a form of radical skepticism. This skepticism suggests that much of what we take to be knowledge might actually be unjustified belief, subject to doubt and uncertainty. The underdetermination principle presents a significant challenge to our understanding of knowledge. It forces us to confront the possibility that our beliefs about the world might be no more justified than alternative, incompatible hypotheses. By exploring this principle and its implications, we are encouraged to critically examine the foundations of our knowledge and to recognize the limitations of our certainty. In grappling with underdetermination and the skepticism it engenders, we are invited to reflect on the nature of belief, evidence, and justification. Are our beliefs truly supported by rational evidence, or are they vulnerable to alternative explanations that we cannot dismiss?